Hello and welcome to my screencast on building a basic CSS-only drop-down menu. We're going to be building a menu today with valid HTML5, and we are going to try and build a menu that requires absolutely no JavaScript to provide interactivity with the user. Now, JavaScript has often been used to enhance the user experience and make web pages do interesting things. Unfortunately, JavaScript is also very powerful and may cause security problems. A lot of hackers will use JavaScript, and that means that a lot of people may actually be using their browsers with JavaScript disabled. Now that can happen a lot, let's say, in corporate environments much more than the individual end user, but it is nonetheless something that web designers have to work around. And it does limit a lot of the things that we can do. So one of the most interesting things that has happened in recent years is that menus mostly have been the place where developers have really concentrated on upgrading their skills in CSS, which is a language for presentation only. And therefore, a basic HTML list can be made interactive with CSS only, which doesn't present the security risks that JavaScript does. So if we take a look at my screen right here, I've got a very basic menu. So there's the home icon, there's animals, which is our drop down, and then there's contact. So the drop down is actually this sublist that shows up only when I put my cursor on top of the word animals. So this is exactly what we're going to be building. Note that there's no fancy decoration yet. We're actually only concentrating on using CSS to add the functionality. The actual decoration of the menu can come later once you understand how to actually make it work. So what we're going to do is we're going to be switching between, let's say, this final version over here and the original blank version that we have to start, and we're going to be using Adobe Dreamweaver to be able to put that together. So this is all the code here that we will be writing today. And we are going to be doing that in our completely empty document. Take a look down here. The only thing that I've got to show is the title, Basic CSS Only drop-down menu. Now, the concepts that we're going to take a look at today, a lot of these things are actually basic HTML and/or CSS concepts. The hard part is chaining them all together into something that actually works. So a lot of these things are things that I teach to students in an introductory HTML CSS class, and like I said, the hard part isn't so much the individual concepts themselves, it's being able to understand how to put them together. Now, the first thing that we have to understand is that we are relying on the CSS Box Model to put this all together. Cascading Style Sheets understands HTML elements as living within an invisible box. And those boxes have a height, they have a width, padding, border, and margins. Understanding that aspect of each tag that you write gives you the ability to write rules to control them, and that's where menus come from, because you can target, the outside box, the menu item itself, then the list items that are inside that, and then even the links that are inside the list items. So there's many boxes that we actually get to see. Other things that we will see is the CSS properties of block and inline. A block level element, which is much of the elements that we use, so paragraphs, headers, all sorts of different things, divs, all occupy the available horizontal space. So if they're written inside a body, they'll take up the entire width of the page. If they're inside a box, they'll take up as much space as they can inside that box. Most of the tags that we use are block level elements, but there's always a few, separate ones that tend to confuse things, most notably the image tag. Inline elements are the opposite, as I said, so there's very few of those, but sometimes knowing when to force something to be inline as opposed to block is pretty important. The interactivity that we're going to be building today really relies on the CSS display property. So when you go display block, that forces an element to act like a block level element. It takes up the entire width of the screen, but it also, basically shows up. It forces it to be this sort of rectangle that the browser must deal with. The opposite of display block is display none, which forces that element to basically completely disappear from the browser's window. So in essence, none makes it disappear and block forces it to show up. The second aspect of the interactivity relies on what's known as the LoveHa Rule. Love basically means L for link, V for visited, H for hover, and A for active. The links that we are going to be building today are all a link, but we want some things to happen when we hover over certain links. So for example, we want something in the regular state on a link to be displayed none. Our submenu is not going to be shown at all on regular links, but when we hover over that link, we will force it to display block so that the menu appears. Classes and IDs are ways to give names to pretty much anything inside HTML, and we're going to be using a couple of classes to say this is the menu, this is the submenu, this is the actual list item that contains the submenu, so we'll be using names wherever necessary. Now in HTML and CSS, a class or an ID basically function exactly the same way. A rule that you would write for a class, you could apply to an ID. It's pretty much the same thing. In general, it's recommended that people use classes over IDs. Classes actually make the browser work a lot less, and so your performance is better when you can use classes. IDs are required when you want to target something very specifically, usually with JavaScript. But in our case, for the examples we're going to be doing today, either or will work. And finally, the HTML tags that we are going to be using today are lists, the li tag, or actually the UL for the unordered list, the OL for the ordered list, and the LI is actually the list item within the list itself. So to make that a bit more easy to understand, you can have either a UL, so an unordered list, which is a list that lists its items in no particular order, so they are preceded with bullets. An ordered list basically is the piece of paper, if you want, but the items on it are numbered. So number 1 is the first, number 2 is the second, and all of this is handled automatically by the browser. The OL or UL is actually the piece of paper that your list is written on, and each piece of information that is on that list is nested inside an LI tag. And finally, our sublist. Our submenu is actually a list within a list. So what you have to do is essentially inside the list, you would put another list. So let's say UL, a list item, and before you close that list item, you put another complete UL tag with its own set of LIs inside. So you basically wind up having two lists, but one inside the other. That's how the drop-down menu works. So that basically sets up the stage for what we're going to be doing, and in a few minutes we're actually going to start coding. So the first thing that we have to do in starting to code a menu is to actually use the HTML list tag and start defining the structure of the links that we want to have. Now, it's actually quite simple to do once you understand the basic syntax of what list does. Now, I'm going to use an unordered list. Semantically speaking, so the language, what that means is that here is a set of links in no real particular order. Like, they're not numbered, so it's not important that one comes before the other. It is basically organized in a subjective way, not a mathematical way. So I'm going to be using the UL tag, and like everything that we write in HTML, whatever you open, so I'm opening the list tag here and I am closing it there. Now I'm basically going to be creating a menu that supposes that the website is about animals. So what I first have to do is I am going to say that, okay, my first list item is something called home. So it's a link back to my home page. Easy enough to do. I'm going to have a second list item, which is the animals. And my third link, or basically the third link in the visible menu, is going to be the contact form. Now, pretty much every website has to have home. You always want to be able to reach the person who created the site, so that's contact. And in this case, we're going to be breaking down the very general animals category into 3 different types, so dogs, cats, and birds. Now, semantically speaking, there is actually no difference between my first list, the main list, the actual menu that's going to be visible all the time, and the submenu, which is the part that's going to show up when I hover over the word animals. So, structurally speaking, I can actually, simply copy this. It's the same thing. Paste it down here and change the words. So, I'm going to have dogs. I'm going to have cats. And I am going to have birds. So, like I said, semantically speaking, exactly the same thing. So these 3 things over here are basically my my list items inside my list. Same thing over here. I have 3 list items, and both of these, the parent tag is the list tag, the unordered list. So if I were, for example, to take a look at this right now, straight right to the browser without anything fancy going on, I have basically 6 list items, and they all look exactly the same. So they have the preceding bullet, and you can't tell the difference whether this is one list with 6 items or 2 lists with 3. It's not styled in any way. Now notice that right now these are not clickable. They are actually not links yet, but compare that, for example, to what I've got over here. There is no anchor tag. So obviously I need these to be links so that I can link to my other pages. And using Dreamweaver here, I'm simply going to click my cursor, put my cursor into the link box down here in the properties panel. And I'm just going to put a hashtag in there, which in HTML basically means that this link exists, it is functional, but it does not go anywhere. It is a null link. I could type this in the code window here in Dreamweaver, but it's a lot slower than just coming down here and hitting the 1 character and hitting return. So one of the beauties of Dreamweaver is that it speeds things up quite a bit. So I'm going to do that for all my links, and then I'm going to go take a quick look back in my browser to see what that looks like. Refresh that. And did I save my page? No, it didn't save my page. So make friends with the save key. That's always good. And come back here, refresh, and there we go. It's starting to look a lot more like what I wanted it to. Now, I'm going to be wanting to make this part of the menu go across, and I want my dogs, cats, and birds to be underneath animal. So I've got a couple of steps. What I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to hide the dot. I'm going to want to hide the actual underline below my links, and of course I'm going to have to nest my list underneath animals. So we need a little bit of CSS to be able to do that, and I'm actually going to come up here and I'm going to actually start coding that. Now you see over here I put a little bit of CSS. Basically I made my my title big and gray, and I made my anchors actually fairly big so that when you take a look at them here on screen, you don't have to zoom in to see the details. It's much more, let's say, user-friendly at that size. But in terms of actual, let's say, design, one of the first things that I want to do is I want to remove that silly underline underneath my, my links. So right here, I am going to paste a rule. And we see, and this is the beginning of my using the LoveHa rule, I have the A for the anchor tag, but I'm being very specific. I'm saying only in its link state, its normal state, do I not want to have any decoration under my text. So basically that's going to get rid of my underline. So coming back over here, if I refresh, all the underlines are gone. So first things first, that actually helps quite a bit. So it's starting to look like something a bit more interesting. The other thing that I want to do, and you know, is basically get rid of these little bullets here, these dots. Very good if I'm actually making a list, like on the page, and it needs to look like a list of items. But in this case, because it's a navigation bar, I'm going to be building a lot more interesting visual effects that don't need that. So back over here into Dreamweaver, on its own separate line, I am going to say unordered list, and the type of list style, so list style type, none. Basically meaning no decoration in front of the list items. So come over here, refresh that, they all disappear. So this is really starting to look a lot more interesting. And like I said before, I'm going to have to basically merge this part of the list, dogs, cats, and birds, underneath animals. So if I scroll down to my HTML, like I said, what I want to do is I want to integrate this list down here into this list item there. So I'm actually going to format the HTML a little bit so that you can sort of see things much more clearly. And this is one of the things that's nice about HTML is you can add as much white space as you need to your code just to make it more easy to read. So right now we've got the UL which opens and closes, so up here. I've got my first list item there, and the item inside I'm going to indent a little bit so that we can actually see that we've got 3 levels there. So list, so imagine the piece of paper, and 3 individual entries on my piece of paper. These are the list items, and piece of paper ends there. So list item, anchor tag with clickable text, other list item, other clickable text, etc. Now the whole trick is if this is my entire list, I want to add this other list underneath animals. Now I can't take this and simply move it here in between, let's say, this list item and that list item. There's no relationship now between this list item and this list. It's basically going 1, 2, 3, and 4. This one is actually supposed to be part of 2. It's supposed to be in there. So instead of putting it after the closing li tag, I want to move that li tag and put it after my list. Now the spacing is not important, okay? But what's important is that the li here starts, so list item, linked to animals, and before I close the list item, I have the entire other list, and then I close the list item. So once again, if I save that and I go take a look at what's going on in Firefox, you can see I have home, animals, and then this part is indented. It's underneath animals, and then I have contact. And I haven't done any anything special in terms of presentation yet. It's just the basic HTML rules as interpreted by the browser goes, this is one list, I've got 3 things, and this is different. It's a different piece of information. It's not aligned the same way. It's actually indented underneath animals, and that convention is there to make me understand that, we're going 1, 2, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, and then 3. So logically speaking, that makes a lot of sense because I've got a small website, I've got my home page, I've got several pages about animals, but they're broken down into 3 subcategories. So if I come over here, okay, this part here is what's indented inside my list, and I'll just indent the closing tag there so it's nicely aligned and it makes more sense. So remember that this li on line 100 is closed by the /li on line 110. All of this is one big unit. So if I go back and I compare this to what I'm actually going to eventually have, I want this box, which basically is my menu. This is my menu bar. And I want my items to be horizontally across the page, and then I'm going to want my sub list to drop down and show up like this. Okay. So right now we can basically look at this and go, all of these elements here are acting like block level elements. They are all taking space on the line here. And one thing that's really great about CSS, and depending on the tools that you have, you can do it in many different ways. But to take a look at that box model, what you can do is you can force the browser to draw a box around everything. So, and that's what the asterisk in programming in many different languages, what it means. It's a wildcard. So this little structure here, HTML and wildcard. So wildcard, that's a descendant of HTML. So anything that is a descendant of HTML, which is absolutely everything on the page, I'm going to give it a nice little border that's going to be 1 pixel wide, solid line, and it's going to be red. And to make things a bit more visible, I will add a little bit of margin. Let's say 6 pixels, and padding also of 6 pixels, just to make things visible. I'm going to delete this very quickly, but it makes this a lot more easy to understand. You can see here that my H1 is inside a box, my home is inside a box, and it's taking up all the available space. That's a block level element. My animals is the same thing, and then my sub list is actually also acting like a block level element. Not the actual anchors themselves. This here is the li, but the anchor that's inside, anchors are not block level elements. They are inline, so they don't take up all the space. But once I'm out of my my sublist, I get back to contact, which is also acting like a block level element. So it's actually very easy to start understanding that even with just a little bit of tags, you've got a lot of boxes that you can play with. All of these boxes could have different colors, different colored text, different outlines, background pictures, all sorts of decoration, which would make it very easy to style without having to add extra HTML. There's a lot to start with before you go and create non-semantic HTML that doesn't really mean anything, but you're only adding it in to be able to decorate it. So the best thing that people can do is refrain from that impulse of throwing in extra code. Use the code that comes with your message. So as I said, I'm going to actually delete this for now. Go back to my normal state. And like I said, I'm going to actually start building this into something that looks like a navigation bar. So over here I have my text decoration. This turns out the outlines. I've got the list itself, which basically doesn't have anything. Okay. Nothing in terms of decoration. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually start targeting different parts of my code because they have to behave in different ways. So I'm actually going to talk or address rather the first level list, which will be my actual menu. So I'm going to call it very simply, I'm going to call it menu. So menu is the outside container. It is the box that really does absolutely contain everything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a lot of actual instructions so that it really starts looking interesting, but I'm going to go through the different properties that I'm going to include one by one. All right, so I have created a selector here for an unordered list that has a class of menu. Notice that I'm repeating the list style type, so actually I don't really need that anymore. I can get rid of that because this rule over here applies to all lists and, well, all unordered lists, and this one being an unordered list will follow that rule. But these instructions here, so the list of class menu, these rules will only apply to this specific selector. It won't apply to all the unordered lists. So what I've decided to do is, first of all, I'm going to give it a gray outline. So a 1 pixel, almost black but not quite line. So there's a line there. The line is pushed away from the text by 6 pixels on either side. So inside my box I have a 6 pixels worth of inner margin. The box itself is going to be 36 pixels tall. And I have a line height of 36 pixels, which essentially means that because the height and the line height match up, I'm going to be able to vertically center my text. The box itself will be 65% of the screen wide, and it will be 12 pixels, let's say from the top and the bottom, and it's going to be automatically centered. The left and right margins are set to automatic. So let's just save that and go take a look what happens. Refresh, and there we go. I've got my box. It is 65% of my screen, and my items are starting to fit in there, but obviously it's not quite perfect. The main thing that is kind of screwing things up is that, you know, my animals and my contact are not going across the menu. They're still acting like block level elements. So back to here, okay, what do? I have to basically force them to display inline. Nothing easier than to say list items that are direct descendants of the unordered list that's called menu, display them in line. Okay, this one over here is not always used, but it does basically give me the option or the flexibility of saying only the list items that are immediately descendant of this UL tag. Because remember, I'm going to have others down here. I'm going to have, you know, the LI here is a direct descendant of menu, but then I've got these other ones down here which are the children of this list, which is inside the LI. So they're much deeper inside the code. So what I want is simply to say, okay, you know, only the first ones display in line. And there we go. This is starting to work. My list over here is basically the one that is kind of messing up my menu, because this one sort of breaks the flow, and this one's kind of like, being pushed down by the menu that's there. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to hide my submenu and see if at least I can get my menu working properly the way that I want it to. And to do that, what I'm going to do, it's going to make it a lot easier to understand as well, is I'm going to come into this menu down here and I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call it Submenu. So I have my menu and I have my submenu. So in my CSS, what I'm going to do is very simply, I'm going to tell it submenus will not display, by default. So by putting this over here, okay, look at the structure. I have an unordered list of class submenu. So notice all of this is like one big word, ul.submenu. So submenu class that is attached to a ul, which is a descendant of an li, so the list item, and that list item is actually part of a list called menu. So it's very, well, it's an accurate description of what's going on here. I've got this UL, which is a submenu. It's inside this list item, and that list item is inside this list. So menu has a child called list item. The list item has a child that's called submenu. So 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations. So this list now will not display at all. I want to hide it. So if I save that and I go back here and I refresh, okay, now I've actually got something that's starting to look like what I want it to. So I've got home, I've got animals, I've got contact. But obviously, I've got a problem. My submenu's not showing at all when I put my cursor on top of animals and I want to know what's in there. So I've basically got to turn off this rule in certain situations. Essentially, what that means is I've got to refer to my LoveHa rule, so link, visited, hover, and active, and basically tell it, well, when I am actually hovering my mouse over this very same item, I want to actually make something happen. So I can actually start with this code here and paste it down there, and I'll be putting my decoration rules over there. But what I want to say is that when I put my mouse over the list item, and remember that the list item is the word that has animals in it, and when I'm hovering over animals, I want this guy to show up. So I have to say when I'm hovering over this one. So hover. So the submenu that is inside the list item that's being hovered upon, that's obviously inside my main menu, I want to go display block. As simple as that. Come back here, refresh that, and there we go. It actually does start working. So it's not perfect, things are kind of moving around in weird ways, but the interactivity is there. All we have to do is fine tune it and make sure it, basically it works properly. Now, for display purposes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually, throw in a bunch of rules there so it starts looking, visually pleasant. So I am going to give it a 1 pixel red border, so it's pretty obvious where it is. I'm going to give some rules here as far as where it's going to be positioned, which I'll explain in due course. So the submenu will display, so display block when I hover over it. It's going to be outlined in red for now. I have positioned it from the top and the left. Like I said, I'll explain that in a bit. The menu is going to be 200 pixels tall, 120 pixels wide. it has no margins. The text inside of my submenu will be inset by 4 pixels, and the background color of the actual submenu is going to be white. Come over here, refresh, and take a look what happens. Whoa, what's going on there? Basic CSS Problems 101. I've got my menu way over there, and obviously I can't go to it because when I roll over, it disappears. That's actually really normal, okay? It's one of the main problems in understanding CSS. And it's actually relatively easy to explain, but you have to understand some of the things about how the browser understands HTML. Now, if I take a look at the rules over here, I said that my submenu was absolutely positioned. Okay, it'll be easier to understand if I actually replace absolute with relative. If I come back here and I show my relative menu, okay, it still works, okay, but you can see that it's acting independent, or not independently rather, but dependently on its relationship with the things that are around it. So there's animals, there's contact, and it does sort of mess my menu when I start interacting with it. For the browser, that is actually that my menu is inside the text flow of the page. So for the browser, when it actually reads the HTML, it goes, okay, the first thing is this big title. I'm going to draw that first on the screen. Then I'm going to start drawing this box. And then the first thing I'm going to put is this guy over here. And then I'm going to start putting this guy. And then all of a sudden there's this piece of text. And for the browser, it's basically trying to draw these things on the screen one after the other. And because my submenu is right now in a relative relationship with the code that's up here and the code that's down there, it disappears when I'm not hovering over it. It appears when I do place my cursor in the right position on the screen. And then, because it's still in a relationship with everything that's on there, it messes up the display of the screen because it suddenly kind of shows up. And that's why initially I had the code absolute right there. To the browser, an absolutely positioned element has nothing to do with the rest of the text that's coded on the page. So the absolute relationship breaks the text flow, and the elements that are on the page, when the absolute item shows up, they don't pay any attention to it. It just shows up, okay, and doesn't disrupt anything on the page. So if I come back here, that's what's happening. The other items don't change at all, but my problem is that the menu's showing up over there. And the reason for that is that when you take a look at the HTML, think of it from the browser's point of view. The browser reads this code and goes, oh, there's this thing over here, and it's absolutely positioned. So the browser has to ask, okay, absolutely positioned relative to what? And what the browser does, it goes up the family tree and goes, okay, first element, the one that contains this, do you have a positioning rule? Are you relatively positioned or not? And right now, this actually does not have any positioning. So the browser says, okay, you don't have any rules. I'm going to go see your parent tag. So it goes over to the UL and asks, well, do you have a positioning rule? And this one says, no, sorry, I don't have any rules. So browser keeps on going. What is the parent tag of UL? Well, that's way up here. It's my body tag. And my body tag, I don't have anything in my CSS that says anything about body. So the browser keeps on going, and the only place it can stop is at the very first tag, not the declaration at the top, not the document type definition, but the actual first HTML tag is HTML. So HTML, being the very first thing in the code, represents the top corner of the window. So when I come over here, my menu is being positioned relative to the top corner of the window. It has nothing to do with, where I actually want it to be, which is relative to the top corner of animals. I want the menu to be down here. So what I have to do is simply I have to tell the browser that this list item over here, so the immediate parent of the submenu, this one actually does have a special property. And I'll do that by actually giving it a class. So it's important to give it a name because I can give properties to certain names. And I am going to call this one the Submenu Parent. Kind of a long name, but it actually makes a lot of sense. So it is the parent of the submenu. And Submenu Parent is going to be given a position relative rule, so that when the browser starts going up from the submenu up the hierarchy, okay, it's going to hit Submenu Parent, and Submenu Parent is going to have a rule that basically says, okay, well, when you draw that menu, make it relative to this item, not the other one. So Submenu Parent, which is the class, is applied to the list item, and there's a space over here, which means the list item is inside of the menu, or the list, the unordered list called menu. If I save that and go back to my browser and refresh, then my menu shows right underneath animals where I want it to be. And now to quickly sum up the work that we've done so far, and then finish up with actually decorating the menu a bit more. It's important to understand that what we've been doing is we've been manipulating the CSS box model. Every tag, whether it's the anchor, the list item, the list body, absolutely every tag in HTML exists within its own box. And this box is actually defined by the World Wide Web Consortium as having, sort of multiple levels to it. And this is the diagram actually from the w3.org website. And we take a look here, and this is the content. So when we are writing a CSS rule, we often refer to the content. So that could be a list item, it could be an anchor within a list item, etc., etc. So if we say, for example, list item has a certain width, a certain height, it is the content in the middle that receives that definition. But the box itself still has other elements to it. So the box starts from the content, but then there's the inner margin. So inside what we see on the screen, there's a bit of space. And then in between that inner margin and, let's say, the border, the line around it, that's where the padding is, and on the outside of that you actually have the margin being transparent. So if you imagine, for example, the anchor tag inside an li, well, the anchor tag has all of these elements, so margin, border, padding, and obviously the content inside. But the list item itself has sort of all these boxes. And then the menu, the unordered list, also has all of these boxes. So all of those taken together give you the possibility to actually design and add color and lines and background textures and all sorts of different things to each element in the HTML code. So when we switch over to Firefox here and we start taking a look at the menu that we've built, right now we've only added really two elements of style, one border around the actual unordered list and one around our submenu unordered list. But we tend to forget that everything that's in here also has its own box model that comes along with it. So there's multiple ways of being able to inspect that box model to understand what you have going on. There is one add-on to Firefox called Firebug, which is extremely popular in the web development community. And you can take the blue icon, the blue arrow icon here, and you can actually go in and hover over different elements. And you see in the HTML window which elements in the code you're hovering over. So as we go over dogs, it reveals the anchor tag for dogs, and go down to cats and birds. And on the right hand side we have the CSS that goes along with those different tags. So as you go in and inspect different things, you can actually turn on or off the CSS rules over here and see how that applies. Now, the arrival of Firebug inside the web design community was sort of hailed as a miracle. It was absolutely wonderful. It was a great debugging tool. And it didn't take long before Adobe actually did the same thing and implemented a sort of inspector of their own. Now, I'm mentioning Firebug now, but pretty much every browser nowadays has their own web development tools. They're often called developer tools, and they're inside Google Chrome, they're inside Opera, they're inside IE. Internet Explorer has their own, and they all have their strengths and weaknesses, but they all pretty much do the same thing. Now, in Dreamweaver, when you turn on, let's say, the design view, the design view itself it's a preview. It's okay. It's not perfect. But however, when you click the live button and you actually enable the true web design preview engine inside Dreamweaver, that happens to be WebKit, which is the same engine that drives a lot of the modern browsers. So in live view, you actually do get to interact with your page as if you were in a browser. But there's an additional mode that you can enable when you're in live view, and that's inspect. So when you turn that on, it basically looks the same thing as what Firebug will display. So right now I can come over here and I can actually see the box model as I hover over different elements. And if I go into split view at the same time, you can actually see the HTML code that's being used when you hover over different things. So right now I'm over contact, and the anchor tag with the clickable text contact is highlighted. Go over here to animals, I can see I'm same location. Go out here, I see the entire submenu. Go down into the white area, it highlights body. Now remember that the point of this is that all of these different tags have boxes. And when people have web design problems, it's usually related to the box model, at some level. So getting a clear understanding of how all these different boxes fit into one another is very, very important. Sometimes you have one element that's out of place and you can't really figure it out why, but if you enable the box view, you can see that, let's say, one box is pushing the other one out of the way. So once we've done that, what we want to do is we want to use those different boxes and start giving our design a lot more style, so actually making it look good. Everything that we've done so far has been really to make it work. So if we come back here, and I'll close Firebug, get that out of the way. One of the things that we have had to do was make sure that our positioning enabled our menu to be exactly where we want it. And that, for a lot of people, that's the tricky part. Now, the rule of thumb, the one thing that you need to understand about CSS positioning is that for the browser, an absolutely positioned element is taken out of the text flow, and it is positioned basically where you tell it. So much from the top, so much from the left. The tricky part being the top and left corner of what. So in a very sort of summarized way, we created the submenu and we told it that it was going to be absolutely positioned, and by default it was showing up here in the top left corner of the screen. The minute that we told the browser, okay, the submenu parent element, so the actual list tag with the word animals in it, is position relative. This absolutely positioned child element was therefore snapped into position because the top left corner was being calculated from the corner of animals. So if I go and hover over animals here, you can see that the blue outline around animals, that's the place or the location where the menu is being positioned from. So this top corner here above the A, that being the top corner of animals, my menu is now being pushed down from that corner by the amount that I give in my CSS. So if I come back to my CSS over here and I take a look at my submenu, right now it's being positioned 18 pixels from the top and 0 from the left. So if I go and change this to some ridiculous number, let's say 78 instead of 18, and I come back here and I refresh, I'll turn Firebug off again, my menu is much further down than where it was before. So much so that when I move my cursor off animals, I actually turn off the hover and I can't even get to the menu down there. If I went, for example, up here and I put, minus 20 pixels and refreshed again, my menu is now above my word. Okay. So when you're building the drop-down menu, the trick is basically to find the perfect number where the menu appears in the proper location below your text, not too far that you can't hover and reach your menu, and obviously not too high where it's going to kind of be hiding your actual work. So if I put, let's say, 20 pixels here and I come down and I refresh, my menu's a bit lower, I can still hover over it properly, and I would be able to fine-tune this. So let's say maybe try 25, for example. That's a bit of trial and error. I can still over here move down quite easily, but the top of my menu, if I'm going to have that being visible, I want the lines to actually line up perfectly. So I'll try 26 pixels over here. And now my red line is exactly on top, and you can see that works fine. It's a bit trickier than what I had with 25, so sometimes the menu does disappear a bit, but it's actually working quite well. So the next step, and the final step really, is to start decorating the menu, make it actually look pretty. Right now, as I said before, we're really working on making this work, the functionality aspect, even though we are using cascading style sheets, which is a decoration-only language. The interactivity had to be built with specific CSS rules and properties. And now that we've actually got it working, now's the time to actually make it look good. So this is where design starts. Now I'd like to remind you that everything that we've done here is actually pure CSS. If I go in Firefox and I go to the page style menu item and I go no style, I still have nothing but, a bunch of lists, one inside the other. There's absolutely nothing structurally speaking that's not, very, very simple HTML. The beauty of what we've done is that we've used cascading style sheets to make that list appear in a very specific kind of way. And as I said at the beginning of the tutorial, there's no JavaScript involved, so security problems are not an issue here. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to start the ball rolling, give a couple of examples of how we can make this menu appear nicer. Now, obviously, I have to target different things and, give them a little bit of style one after the other. Now, one of the most important things that we can do is we can use the qualities or the properties of what's called the LoveHa Rule. Now, I mentioned that before. And what I'm going to do to start off is I'm actually going to target the link or the anchor tag inside the list item that's inside my submenu, which is obviously only visible when I'm in a hover state on one of my menu items. So remember that LoveHa, okay, and I'll just type this up here to remind everyone. There's link, there's visited, there's hover, and there's active. So each one of those states corresponds to a certain point in time when you are using an anchor. Link is the anchor itself on the page. When it loads, you haven't done anything. It's just there, and it's in its pristine sort of state. Visited is obviously you've gone to the page that is linked to, and you are then basically told you've been there, you don't need to necessarily go back. Hover is when your mouse is over the link, and active is when you're actually literally clicking down on the link. So active is the one that you probably see the least. So in this selector here, which is a very long, complex selector, to make things easy, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the color. So the simple color rule in CSS, and I can even use the color picker in Dreamweaver here, and I'm going to give like a sort of dark sort of burgundy type of color to my link. So if I go back and refresh over here, you can now see that my links have a specific color. It's not the same one as the regular menu because my CSS selector is very specific. It's, the links inside the submenu. Now I can give, all the CSS properties I want to this link right now. So for example, I could give it a border, and it might be, let's say, 1 pixel, a solid line. I don't know, I'll make it pink. Now there are a few keywords that are supported in CSS as far as colors. By far it would be preferable to actually use a number code to do that. For today's demonstration, I mean, this is fine. So you can see here that my dog, cat, and birds text is a specific color, and you can see the little pink border showing up around it. And notice that my my border is really stuck on the edge of my text. So if we zoom in a bit more, okay, literally it doesn't always touch, but very, very close to it. So my box model, and the link, the anchor tag itself is an inline element, so it's not taking up all the entire space, but it is very close to my text. So dogs and cats and birds are not of the same size. They don't have the same width. If I go over here and I add a little bit of padding, and let's say I'll put, I don't know, let's say 6 pixels to make it fairly obvious. If I come back and refresh, you can now see that my text, okay, has a lot more space in between the letters and the border. So that's the inside margin, okay? Remember that box model. When we take a look at this over here, my content is my text, and the padding is in between the content and the border. So that's what's happening here. I'm actually starting to make this look, a certain way, and my box model is reacting accordingly. Now, for example, if I wanted to force my my boxes all to be the same, okay, I could delete my padding, because padding just adds space inside, different size boxes. But if I go display block, and I come back here and refresh, these boxes are now all exactly the same. Okay, display block literally forces an object to take up all the available space on the line that it's on. So the actual number of letters, for example, in the words becomes irrelevant. Now, all of this is applied to the link in its normal state. But there's 4 states that I can play with. The whole LoveHa thing is, each one is a state. So if I copy my selector here, and I paste it on a different line, and I go down the list of states here in order. It's very important that you do link first, visited second, hover third, and active last. If you don't keep them in the right order, one or several of them will not work properly. So I'm going to simply go visited here, and I will change my color to, let's say, a pale gray. I'm going to delete all this stuff here simply because, I want it to look different. I'm still going to keep display block because I want the boxes to be the same size. Come over here, refresh, and come down here. And why is that not working? Did I save everything? Yes, I did. And where's my problem? Visited. Okay, I didn't visit the pages, that's why. So there we go. Click, and then all of a sudden, apparently, I have visited those pages. I was actually thinking I had done hover. But as I said, very important to keep everything in the proper order. So copy this thing all over again, and now it's going to be much more obvious. This is what I was expecting the first time. So hover. So change my color, and this is where it really becomes pretty obvious. Okay, if I go into the color picker over here, and I will choose something, obviously very, very contrasty, very different looking. Let's say something in the blue-green family, or maybe something a bit in the purple. That might be pretty easy to see. So notice that I have one color here, another color there, and a different color here. By the way, every time that the number is the same, okay, here we have 999. That is shorthand for 6 nines in a row. Okay, CSS is always 6 digits or sometimes letters to define a color, but if they're always the same, you can actually use shorthand. Use 3 digits instead of 6. But when it's always the same 3 letters or digits, it's a gray. So any 3-letter or number combo that is the same, AAA, triple B, 999, 333, whatever, for sure it's a gray. Right now, this color is, one primary color off of gray. So if I come over here, and obviously I have to refresh again, now I am starting to see, okay, I have interactivity. So my hover state is now actually starting to come in and give my user feedback, because as they move around and do certain things, the web page responds to that. And that's very, very important. So I will just do one more for the active state. And this one I will, for example, I'll make it, bright red. And I'll copy a border on this one. Once again, red. But how about making it dotted? Come back here, refresh, go over animals. I have to do this quickly. And take a look at what happens when I hover. Okay, I have a dotted line now. Come over here to animals. Everything's gray because I visited those pages. When I quickly go down, all of a sudden these guys change, and if I click, no, that's hover. Doesn't work. Yeah, active. Silly me. Refresh that. So obviously have to get all my coding right. Forgot to change one word there and it didn't work. So animals over here, dogs, and when I click down, there's my active state. That's exactly what I wanted to do. Okay. So right now, all of this is, very, very, very simple stuff. we have 4 different states: LVHA, so link, visited, hover, active. But in terms of design, I haven't really done anything yet. I'm only using the properties of, let's say, the box model and the code. So I'm decorating text, or maybe decorating certain boxes, but there's nothing graphically fancy in these yet. Now, with the advent of CSS3, there's a lot more possibilities. I'm not going to get into that today, but for the longest time, web designers have been using different types of let's say graphic designer tricks, where we're actually using images to come in and add a different level of style to the elements that we've coded. So you can do a lot of decoration just by coding it using CSS, but once you start getting into your actual, let's say Photoshop, Illustrator, color, creating graphics, you can integrate all of those different things and basically add them to the rules that we have created. So for example, if we take a look at this selector over here, which controls the submenu. Okay, I've made it display block. It has a border that's red. It's absolutely positioned, etc., etc. But the only thing that concerns style about it, in terms of color and contrast and everything, is that it's white. The background color is white. But I would be able to actually go in and add a background picture to that. So for example, if I just start typing background here and I come down to the menu item for background image, in Dreamweaver I can go get a gradient that I built in Photoshop, saved as a JPEG. It's relatively small, and I put that in the image folder inside my root. If I select that, I now have not only just code and color being assigned to my submenu, I actually have an image. And this is where a lot of people starting to have a lot of graphic design fun in Dreamweaver and web design in general, is when they can start bringing in certain things that do not come simply from coding. So you can see here that I actually have assigned a gradient JPEG to my submenu. Now it's not perfectly aligned because I made it dark at the bottom and light at the top. So it's kind of like bottom heavy, which was the style that I wanted. Okay, so right now, see background image there, that works fine, but I want to align it. So I actually want it to be starting at the bottom of the menu rather than at the top. Because remember, basically, unless you tell the computer otherwise, everything starts at the top left corner. So I'm going to go background position bottom. So start at the bottom of the menu. And you can see there that, okay, now I've got some dark space at the top there. I also don't want this thing to repeat. I only want it to repeat in one specific way, which is I want it to repeat across. So let's say the x-axis rather than the y-axis. If you remember your high school math, you have the x, which is one way, and y is the other. So I only want it to repeat in one sense. And there we go. So my image is not repeating, so it's white at the top. I basically see my background color, the one that's coded the triple F through there. I've got the image showing up as the background, and it's obviously starting to have some style. Now my actual list items themselves, they're hard to read right now because I can't really see them where the grays are starting to match up. So if I come back and start considering, okay, which one of these, do I want to control? Okay, I might want to keep, let's say, the different colors that I have there, but I want to add a background color behind my text. So this is the background color, let's say, of the list item, but not the actual anchor that is inside the list item. So I can actually make a different selector, and it'll keep me from having to paste white, let's say, in all of these. So I can do that down here. And I'm going to apply it to, let's say, menu, list item, hover, all the way to list item, but not the anchor. So I really want the list item itself to have a white background. So all of that, and obviously the curly brackets in CSS are really important. So menu, list item on the hover state, submenus, list item over here, background white. Let's go take a look at what happens with that. And there, my text is obviously a lot easier to read, and it's starting to, have a certain beauty to it. Now, taking a look at my actual submenu over here, it's important that I start taking a look at certain things like the padding and the margins. When I take a look at my submenu there, my sort of buttons inside the submenu don't take up a lot of space, and they are block level items. So, what's keeping them from being any bigger? And that's probably the total of 8 pixels of padding, because there's 4 on the left, 4 on the right. If I change this to 0 over here, save that and go back, then my items are, slightly bigger, not by much. Let's go take a look if there's anything else that's in, quote unquote, the way. I do not have a lot of stuff there. And there is, there's no padding or margin rules over here either. So let's take a look. List items have margins of 12 over there. This is my main menu, so that doesn't really apply. These guys, list items there, submenu, display none. Okay, so my submenu down here is really the place where everything's happening. I have no margins and no padding, so that really basically sets everything up for being, pretty much as big as it can be. So what I'm going to try to do over here is I'm going to, on my list items, let's say give them no padding. Remember that the list item holds the anchor. So I'm going to make sure that that one has no padding whatsoever. Let's go take a look at what that does. Okay. And over here, I'm going to give them a margin, let's say, of 0. See what that does. There, that was really the big one that was responsible for everything. Now, notice that I had to do a bit of exploration to try and figure out what was going on, okay? But you always want to work with that understanding of the box model. The box model is relatively simple in theory and relatively complicated in practice. There's always, it's either, let's say, the padding of one element or the margin of the other one. If one is inside the other, it's not always intuitively easy to understand which one is the one that has the greatest effect. So that's why, for example, people use Firebug or the inspector in Dreamweaver to actually make this something that they can see. It's easy to, when you're beginning, to sort of get lost in all these different rules and can become somewhat frustrating. But if you refer to the graphic and you take a look at this and sort of start from that, that's really where things start making a lot of sense. You have to understand this and how it works. So as you can see here, I'm starting to have a lot more control over what's going on. And now if I wanted to make my my list items a bit smaller so I could actually see a bit of the background around the edges of the elements here, that's where the padding value for my submenu is actually going to come into play. So here's my submenu. Down here is my padding, and let's say if I put something like 3 pixels and refresh, there we can see that there's a tiny amount of space around the edge of my elements. Actually, I'll make it a little bit bigger because I want to be able to see it fairly easily. So there we can see it starting to be a nice, there's a nice proportion there. But I do want to space my elements out a bit because they are touching. So now if I, sort of switch and go, that was the submenu, I want to control the submenu's list items. Right now, margin 0. Okay, now I want margin 0 to be on the left and the right side, but I actually want a bit of space on the top and the bottom. So the way that CSS works is that when you write 4 numbers in a row, it's basically the 4 positions on, let's say, on the side of the box, starting from the top and going clockwise. So 0 would be top, then right, bottom, and left. When you put 0, 0 is 0. You don't have to put any sort of increment, so inches, pixels, points, whatever, doesn't matter. 0 is 0. But I want to put, let's say, something like 6 at the top, for example. Or actually, no, I'm changing my mind. I'm going to put 6 on the bottom. So my first item is going to be flush at the top, and then it's going to push the next one down by 6 pixels. So top, right, bottom, and I'll put 6px there. Come over here and see my first item is still perfectly at the top, pushes the other one down a little bit, and that's starting to look, nice. And I've got my interactivity here as well. Okay. Now, it would be possible to, keep on adding the, more and more decoration. I could add a background image, for example, to dogs. I could add a background image to cats. It could be the same one. It could be different ones. But the rules are always the same. When you take a look at your selector, you want to be able to say, okay, when I am on this state, the normal link looks like that. When I have, let's say, something different, a different condition, a different time when things are being used, it looks differently in that context. So actually, I'm going to cheat a little bit over here, and I'm going to go into Google, and I'm going to go find myself a flower picture. Okay. Now remember, it's very important for people to learn, especially in graphics, to always go get images that they are allowed to use. So going into Google right now is something very easy for me to do. When you actually do something for real, it's much better to, go and license an image. So just, for demonstration purposes right now, I'll take, let's say this image over here, and I'll just save that very quickly, and basically save the image as right here, put it inside my my root folder there, and that will be, let's say, flower. So over here in, let's say, my hover state, okay, I could put a background image there. Save that, close this, refresh that, come over there, and when I quickly come down, you can see that my image is actually being put as the background there. Okay. Now, like I said, that's just, a quick demo. I'm actually not going to keep that. Okay. But it's important to understand that all of these properties that we've used apply to anything within that entire structure. So at that point, it really becomes a question of knowing what kind of look that you want, and you can actually design something entirely in Photoshop and then take it apart and start building it layer by layer. So let's say the entire menu itself, this area here, that's your background menu. That's also the first tag. So let's say the nav tag. Inside the nav tag, you actually have the list itself. So the UL, that's another thing that you can decorate. And then you have the list items there that you can, play with. And it just, it keeps on adding layer after layer after layer. But a basic understanding of those CSS rules is what we need to make it happen. So I'm just going to save this. Remember that I deleted that rule, and now if I come over here and refresh, I'm back to where I was. Okay, so that works perfectly okay. So remember that what you want to do is concentrate on the CSS box model, understand how all of those work, and when you start decorating something, you can start from, let's say, the inside, from the content, and define the size of your box and start adding Photoshop elements, for example, or just CSS decoration rules into it, and you'll eventually get something that looks really, really nice.